Historians today frown on the use of the term inevitable to describe historical events. Still, Thucydides' point about the inevitability of the Peloponnesian War is perhaps appropriate. The conflict had been bubbling under the surface for 50 years, and when war finally broke out, it was over a seemingly minor affair. In 433 BCE, Corcyra, Achaemenid front, Trentranisha, asked Athens for protection against Corinth. The Corinthians claimed that the Athenian support of Corcyra was a violation of the 30 Years' Peace. At a subsequent meeting of the Peloponnesian League in Sparta in 432 BCE, the allies, along with Sparta, voted that the peace had been broken, and so declared war against Athens. At the time of the war's declaration, no one thought that it would last 27 years and would ultimately embroil the entire Greek-speaking world. Rather, the Spartans fick what, an army Tothans fight a decisive battle, then return home. The long duration of the war, however, was partly the result of the different strengths of the two leading powers. Athens was a naval empire, with allies scattered all over the Ionian Sea. Sparta, on the other hand, was a landlocked power with a strong contingent of foot soldiers and supporters, chiefly in the Peloponnese, and with no navy to speak of at the outset of the war. The Peloponnesian War brought about significant changes in the government of both Athens and Sparta. So by the end of the war, neither power looked as it did at its outset. Achaeus in particular became more democratic because of increased need for manpower to grow its fleet. The lowest census bracket, the Thetes, whose poverty and inability to buy their own armor had previously excluded them from military service, became by the end of the war a full-fledged part of the Athenian forces and acquired a correspondingly greater degree of political influence. In the case of Sparta, the war had ended the Spartan policy of relative isolationism from the rest of the affairs of the Greek city-states. While war was previously largely a seasonal affair, with many conflicts being decided with a single battle, the Peloponnesian War forced the Greek city-states to support standing armies. Finally, while sieges of cities and attacks on civilians were previously frowned upon, they became the norm by the end of the Peloponnesian War. In short, Thucydides' narrative of the war shows that the war had a detrimental effect on human nature, encouraging a previously unprecedented degree of cruelty on both sides. Still, Greek siege warfare during the 5th century BCE was still quite primitive. As no tools existed for ramming or otherwise damaging the city gates or walls, and catapults were not yet in use, beginning in Thophilus Prentice for 31 BCE, Thespertank Goroskoshishushan, Attica, in order to devastate the agricultural land around the city, the Spartans thereby hoped to provoke the Athenians to a battle. Pericles, however, refused, and instead ordered all inhabitants of Attica to retreat within the city. Pericles' decision was wise, as the Athenians would likely have lost a land battle against the Spartans. His decision, though, had unforeseen repercussions. In 430 BCE, the crowded conditions within Athens resulted in the outbreak of a virulent plague, which by some estimates killed as much as 25% of the city's population over the following 3 years. Among the dead was none other than Pericles himself. Meanwhile, the Spartans continued their annual invasions of Attica until 425 BCE, when luck was finale on the Athenian side. In 425 BCE, the Athenian fleet faced a new Spartan fleet in the Battle of Pylos in the Peloponnese. The Athenians won the battle and also managed to trap 420 Spartans on the tiny island of Spacteria, just off the coast of Pylos. Sending shockwaves through the entire Greek world, the Spartans surrendered by bringing Theostages to Athens. The Athenians put an end to the annual invasions of Attica. Finally, in 421 BCE, with the death of the most pro-war generals on both sides, the Athenians, with their allies, signed a peace treaty with the Spartans and their allies, named the Peace of Nicias after the Athenian general who brokered this treaty. It was supposed to be a 50 years peace. It allowed both sides to return to their pre-war holdings, with a few exceptions. However, several key allies of Sparta, including Corinth and Thebes, refused to sign. Furthermore, Athens made the disastrous decision during this stalemate to launch the Sicilian expedition a venture that took much of the Athenian fleet to Sicily in 415 BCE. The Spartans then took the war to Attic soil by occupying Decelea, a village in Attica proper, and transforming it into a military fort. This occupation allowed the Spartans to prevent the Athenians from farming near Landon, Kataphorphanskstes, effective conveniently for the remainder of the war. The war produced a high level of resentment towards the democratic leaders in Athens. Therefore, in 411 BCE, an oligarchic coup briefly replaced democracy with the rule of the 400. While this oligarchy was quickly overthrown and democracy restored, this internal instability highlighted the presence of the aristocratic element in the city, as well as the dissatisfaction of at least the aristocratic citizens with the long war. Remarkably, in a testament to the resilience and power of the Athenian state, the Athenians managed to rebuild a navy after the Sicilian expedition, and even managed to continue to win battles on sea during this final phase of the war. In 405 BCE, however, the Spartan general Lysander defeated Athens in the naval battle. The city finally surrendered in 404 BCE for the second time in a decade. The Athenian democracy was overthrown, to be replaced this time by the Spartans-sanctioned oligarchy known as the Tyranny of the 30. The rule of the 30 proved to be a much more brutal agary than that of the 400. A year later, an army formed largely of Athenian Democrats in exile marched on the city and overthrew the 30. Democracy thus was restored in 403 BCE, and the painful process of recovery from the war and the oligarchic rule could begin, because it drained Athens of manpower and financial resources. The Peloponnesian War proved to be an utter practical disaster for Athens. Nevertheless, the war period was also the pinnacle of Athenian culture, most notably its tragedy, comedy, and philosophy. Tragedy and comedy in Athens were very much popular entertainment, intended to appeal to all citizens. Thus, issues considered in these plays were often ones of paramount concern for the city at the time when the plays were written. As one character in a comedy bitterly joked in an address to Thudency, Mori Athenian stock traned TD at assembly meetings. Not surprisingly, war was a common topic of discussion in the plays. Furthermore, war was not portrayed positively, as the playwrights repeatedly emphasized the costs of war for both winners and losers. Sophocles, one of the two most prominent Athenian tragedians during the Peloponnesian War era, had served his city as a general, albeit at an earlier period. Thus he had direct experience with war. Many of his tragedies that were performed during the war dealt with the darker side of fighting, for both soldiers and generals, and the cities that were affected.
By tradition.
However, tragedies tackled contemporary issues by integrating them into mythical stories, and the two mythical wars that Sophocles portrayed in his tragedies were the Trojan War, as in Ajax and Philoctetes, and the aftermath of the War of the Seven against Thebes, in which Polyneices, the son of Oedipus, led 6 other heroes to attack Thebes. It's a city led by his brother Eteocles, as in Oedipus at Colonus. Sophocles' plays repeatedly showed the emotional and psychological challenges of war for soldiers and civilians alike. They also emphasized the futility of war, as the heroes of his plays, just as in the original myths on which they were based, died tragic, untimely deaths. Sophocles' younger contemporary, Euripides, had a similar interest in depicting the horrors of war, and wrote a number of tragedies on the impact of war on the defeated, such as in Phoenician Women and Hecuba. Both of these plays explored the aftermath of the Trojan War from the perspective of the defeated Trojans. While the tragic playwrights explored the impact of the war on both the fighters and the civilians through narrating mythical events, comic playwright Aristophanes was far less subtle. The anti-war civilian who saves the day and ends the war was a common hero in the Aristophanic comedies. For instance, in the Achaemenid, the main character is a war-weary farmer who, frustrated with the inefficiency of the Athenian leadership in ending the war, brokers his own personal peace with Sparta. Similarly, in Peace, another anti-war farmer fattens up a dung beetle in order to fly to Olympus and beg Zeus to free peace. Finally, in Lysistrata, the wives of all Greek city-states, missing their husbands who are at war, band together in a plot to end the war by going on a sex strike until their husbands make peace. By the end of the play, their wish comes true. Undeniably funny, the jokes in these comedies, nevertheless, have a bitter edge, akin to the portrayal of war in the TI tragedies. The overall impression from the Warrea drama is that the playwrights, as well as perhaps the Athenians themselves, spent much of the Peloponnesian War dreaming of peace, while the playwrights were dreaming of the things of this world most, notably where their contemporary Socrates was dreaming of difficult questions. One of the most prominent philosophers of the ancient world, Socrates has not left any writings of his own, but thoughts attributed to him survive in dialogues penned by his student, the 4th century philosopher Plato. In Plato's writings, Socrates comes across as someone who loved difficult questions, and who was not above confronting any passers-by with such questions as, what is courage? What is moral? What would the ideal city look like? Using what became known ever since as the Socratic method, Socrates continued to probe further every definition and answer that his conversation partners provided, guiding them to delve deeper in their reflections on the topics at hand than they had before. As a result of his love of such debates, Socrates was seen as connected to the sophists, philosophical debate teachers, who, as Aristophanes joked, could teach anyone to convince others of anything at all, regardless of reality or truth. Socrates radically differed from the sophists by not charging fees for his teaching. Instead, as he himself is purported to have said, he was a pest-like gadfly that kept disturbing Athens from growing to content and encouraged all with whom he spoke to keep thinking and questioning.